choice, reckless ride. Magnolia Maggie Dawson had sworn never to trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Slade, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. The Broken Wagon and the Barren Lands. The sun beat down with the merciless intensity only the high desert could conjure. Magnolia Dawson felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her temple, mingling with the dust that coated everything: her worn leather boots, her faded calico dress, the splintered wood of the wagon that had betrayed her. The wheel, shattered beyond repair, lay accusingly on the parched earth, a monument to her folly, her stubborn insistence on making this journey alone. "Damn fool woman," she muttered, the words tasting of grit and despair. The vastness of the landscape pressed in on her, a panorama of ochre and rust-colored mesas rising against the skies so blue it hurt to look at. The silence was immense, broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow and the whisper of a hot, dry wind that offered no relief. She'd been so sure, so determined to prove she could manage, that she didn't need anyone. Now, here she was, miles from anywhere, her water running low, her hope dwindling with the setting sun. Maggie ran a calloused hand over the rough canvas of the wagon cover. Inside lay the meager remnants of her life, a few precious belongings, a worn quilt stitched by her mother, a handful of books she'd guarded like treasures. She'd sold everything else to finance this journey, this desperate flight from a past that clung to her like the desert dust. A past filled with the cloying sweetness of magnolias and the bitter sting of betrayal. She kicked at the broken wheel, a surge of anger momentarily eclipsing her fear. Anger at herself, at the circumstances, at the man who had driven her to this desolate place. Samuel. The name echoed in her mind, a phantom whisper that still had the power to make her heart clench. She'd loved him with a naive, all-consuming passion, believing his promises, trusting his lies. Until the day she'd found him in the arms of another, his betrayal as stark and brutal as the landscape surrounding her. "Never again," she whispered, the words a vow etched into her soul. She'd sworn never to trust another man, never to let herself be vulnerable, never to rely on anyone but herself. And yet, here she was, utterly helpless, her independence a cruel joke in the face of the unforgiving wilderness. She scanned the horizon, her eyes straining against the glare. Nothing. Just endless miles of rock and scrub, shimmering in the heat haze. A wave of despair washed over her, so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She was alone, truly alone, and the desert was a harsh mistress, indifferent to her plight. She sank onto the cracked earth beside the wagon, her back against the splintered wood. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it was almost unbearable, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fading sun soak into her skin. It was a fleeting comfort, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing fear that had taken root in her belly. She must have dozed, because the sound of approaching hoofbeats jolted her awake. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Bandits? Outlaws? The desert was rife with them, men who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. She scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol she kept tucked in her waistband. It was a pathetic weapon, more a symbol of defiance than actual protection, but it was all she had. The rider emerged from the shimmering heat haze, a silhouette against the dying light. He was tall, lean, riding a magnificent black stallion that moved with a grace that belied its power. As he drew closer, she could make out the details: a weathered face, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and a life lived on the edge. His eyes, dark and intense, scanned the scene, taking in the broken wagon, the lone woman, the desolate landscape. He reined in his horse a few yards away, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. He wore the clothes of a working man, dusty and worn, but there was something about him, an aura of quiet authority, that set him apart. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the holster worn smooth with use. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching her, his gaze unwavering. Maggie swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She gripped the pistol tighter, her knuckles white.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to sound strong. He tilted his head, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Name's Rhett Slade," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that seemed to carry on the wind. "And you, I reckon, are in a bit of a predicament." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a calm certainty that both unnerved and intrigued her. She lowered the pistol slightly, but kept her hand on it. "I can manage," she said, the lie sticking in her throat. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over the broken wagon wheel.
"Can you now?"
He took a step closer, and she instinctively recoiled. He stopped, his expression unreadable. "That wheel's busted clean through. You ain't going anywhere." She glared at him, her pride battling with her fear. "I'll figure something out." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Out here? In the middle of nowhere? You'll be buzzard bait by morning." His words, blunt and brutal, sent a shiver down her spine. She knew he was right. She was trapped. And this stranger, this gunfighter with his haunted eyes and his air of quiet menace, was her only hope. But could she trust him? Could she risk putting her life in the hands of another man after everything she'd been through? He knelt and took a water skin from his saddle, extending it, his eyes suddenly less harsh, reflecting the last embers of twilight. Chapter 2. A stranger's unexpected arrival. Maggie hesitated, her gaze fixed on the offered water skin. Thirst clawed at her throat, a dry, desperate ache that was almost unbearable. Her own supply was dangerously low, barely enough to wet her lips. She knew she should take it, that refusing would be foolish, even suicidal. But pride, that stubborn, defiant part of her, rebelled against the idea of accepting help from this stranger, this man who exuded an aura of danger she couldn't ignore. Rhett Slade remained motionless, his arm outstretched, his expression patient, almost understanding. He didn't pressure her, didn't try to coax her. He simply waited, his dark eyes holding hers in a gaze that seemed to see straight through her defenses. It was that gaze, more than anything, that finally broke her resistance. It wasn't the look of a predator, assessing his prey. It was something else, something she couldn't quite define, a weariness, perhaps a hint of vulnerability that mirrored her own. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and took the water skin. The leather was warm from his touch, and the scent of it a mix of horse sweat, dust, and something indefinably masculine filled her nostrils. She uncorked it and took a long, slow swallow, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. It was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. She handed the water skin back to him, careful to avoid his touch. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on her. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice low and even. "What are you doing out here, all alone?" She hesitated again, unsure how much to reveal. Trusting strangers was not something she did easily, especially not men. "I'm traveling," she said, the vagueness deliberate. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Traveling where?" "West," she said, the answer technically true, if not entirely forthcoming. She'd been heading west, towards the promise of a new life, a fresh start. A place where no one knew her name or her past. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and probing. "You running from something?" he asked, the question direct, unvarnished. She stiffened, her defenses instantly rising. "That's none of your business." He shrugged, seemingly unfazed by her hostility. "Maybe not. But it might be my business if whatever you're running from is following you." Her heart skipped a beat. Had he seen something? Heard something? She scanned the horizon again, her senses on high alert. But there was nothing, just the vast, empty expanse of the desert, bathed in the fading light. "I'm not running from anything," she lied, her voice tight. He didn't argue, didn't press her. He simply turned and began to examine the broken wagon wheel, his movements efficient and purposeful. He ran his hand along the splintered wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This ain't gonna be easy to fix," he said, more to himself than to her. "Gonna need some tools and some wood." Maggie felt a flicker of hope, faint but real. He was actually considering helping her. Do you think you can fix it?" she asked, the question hesitant. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. "I can try," he said, "but it'll take time. And it'll cost you." Her heart sank. She had very little money left, barely enough to buy food and supplies, let alone pay for repairs. "I don't have much," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He studied her again, his gaze assessing, calculating. "I ain't talking about money," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Her breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? What was he asking for? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her momentary hope. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol in her waistband. He saw the movement, and his expression hardened. "Don't be stupid," he said, his voice laced with a hint of warning. "I ain't gonna hurt you." "Then what do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. He held her gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable.
"I want your word," he said.
"Your word that you'll tell me the truth. About who you are, where you're going, and what you're running from." It was a strange request, unexpected. It wasn't the demand of a highwayman or a lecherous advance. It was something else, something that resonated with a deeper, more unsettling chord within her. He wanted her truth. The very thing she'd been guarding so fiercely, the very thing she'd been running from. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their light cold and distant. She looked at him, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, this gunfighter with his haunted eyes and his quiet strength. He was offering her a chance, a lifeline in the face of overwhelming odds. But taking that chance meant risking everything, exposing her vulnerability, surrendering the secrets she'd held so close. She found herself staring, trying to understand, but finding only the quiet resolution in his posture, the way his eyes never faltered, fixed on the remnants of her broken wheel, her broken life. He stood up, brushing the dust from his hands, his decision made, although she had given him no answer yet. Chapter 3. Oaths made under a dusty sky. Maggie's mind raced. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself, to cling to the familiar shield of secrecy. But another part of her, a part that was weary of running, weary of the loneliness and the fear, yearned to unburden herself. To speak the truth, to finally release the weight of her past, felt almost tempting. She looked at Rhett Slade, really looked at him, trying to see past the rugged exterior, the aura of danger that surrounded him. There was a weariness in his eyes, a sadness that hinted at a past as troubled as her own. Perhaps that was what drew her to him, that unspoken recognition of shared pain.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you care?" He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Maybe I don't," he said, his voice low and rough. "Maybe I just need something to believe in. Something other than the dust and the blood and the endless miles." His words struck a chord within her. She understood that feeling, that yearning for something more, something beyond the harsh realities of their existence. She'd felt it herself, that desperate longing for a connection, for a reason to keep going. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The night had fully descended, the desert transformed into a vast, inky expanse under a canopy of stars. The air had grown cooler, carrying a hint of the chill that would settle in before dawn. Maggie took a deep breath, the crisp night air filling her lungs. She made her decision. "All right," she said, her voice stronger now, resolute. "I'll tell you. But you have to promise me you won't judge me. He nodded, a slight softening in his eyes. I ain't got no right to judge anyone, he said. We all got our demons. He gestured towards a small, rocky outcrop a short distance from the wagon.
Let's get out of the open, he said.
And build a fire. It'll get cold tonight. She followed him, her steps hesitant but determined. He gathered some dry brush and twigs, and with a few practiced strikes of his flint and steel, a small fire crackled to life. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rocks, illuminating their faces in a flickering, orange glow. They sat in silence for a few moments, the warmth of the fire a welcome comfort against the growing chill. Maggie watched him, studying the lines on his face, the way the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his gaze fixed on the flames. My name is Magnolia Dawson, she began, her voice quiet but steady. I came from Mississippi. A plantation. Magnolias, like you said. She paused, the memories flooding back, bittersweet and painful. I was married. Or I thought I was. She told him everything, her voice faltering at times, her eyes filling with tears. She told him about Samuel, about his charm and his lies, about the crushing weight of his betrayal. She told him about her flight, her desperate need to escape, to start anew. She held nothing back, pouring out her heart to this stranger, this man who had offered her a lifeline in the middle of nowhere. Rhett listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. He simply listened, his presence a silent anchor in the storm of her emotions. When she was finished, the silence returned, heavier now, laden with the weight of her confession. She looked at him, her heart pounding, waiting for his reaction, for his judgment. He stirred the fire with a stick, the flames leaping higher. That's a hard story, he said, his voice low and rough. But it ain't the worst I've heard. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, so profound it almost made her weak. He hadn't judged her. He hadn't condemned her. He had simply listened and accepted her truth. What about you? She asked, her voice hesitant. What's your story, Rhett Slade? He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. The firelight flickered in their depths, revealing a hint of the pain he carried within. I told you, he said. Dust, blood, and endless miles. That's all there is to it. She knew he was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth. There was more to him than he was letting on, a darkness that lurked beneath the surface. But she didn't press him. She knew, instinctively, that he would reveal his secrets in his own time, if he ever chose to. We all have our secrets, Maggie said, her voice quiet. He looked at the fire. He did not disagree. He did not deny. He simply turned another log over, and the flames reflected and grew. Then he looked at her, directly. I'll fix your wagon, Magnolia Dawson, he said. The oath. It felt strange to have him address her formally. The name he spoke felt formal, and the promise felt heavy. It hung in the air. The first stars were vivid. She would hold him to that. Chapter 4. Echoes of a life left behind. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. Maggie awoke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee, a surprisingly comforting aroma in the desolate landscape. Rhett was already up, tending to the small fire he had kept burning throughout the night. He had a battered tin pot balanced precariously over the flames, the rich, dark scent of coffee wafting from it. She sat up, stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard ground. The remnants of her emotional outpouring from the previous night lingered, leaving her feeling strangely vulnerable and exposed. She had shared her deepest secrets with this stranger, this gunfighter, and she still wasn't sure if it had been a foolish mistake or a necessary step towards healing. He glanced at her, a slight nod his only acknowledgement of her awakening. He poured some coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. Drink, he said, his voice gruff. It'll warm you up. She took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of awareness through her. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the steaming coffee. It was strong and bitter, but it did its job, chasing away the lingering chill of the night. They ate a simple breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, the silence between them punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the sounds of the awakening desert. Maggie watched him as he worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. He seemed completely at ease in this harsh environment, as if he belonged here, a part of the landscape itself. After breakfast, he set to work on the broken wagon wheel. He examined it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had a small set of tools in his saddlebags, and he used them with a skill that surprised her. He was a man of many talents, it seemed, not just a gunfighter. Maggie watched him, her thoughts drifting back to her life in Mississippi. The contrast between that world and this one was stark and jarring. She had grown up surrounded by luxury and privilege, sheltered from the harsh realities of life. Her days had been filled with social gatherings, elegant balls, and the endless pursuit of a suitable husband. It all seemed so frivolous now, so meaningless in the face of the raw, unforgiving beauty of the desert. She remembered the sprawling plantation house, with its white columns and manicured lawns. She remembered the scent of magnolias in bloom, the sweet, heavy fragrance that had always filled the air. She remembered the sounds of laughter and music, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk dresses. It was a world of beauty and refinement, but it was also a world of secrets and lies. Her father, a wealthy plantation owner, had been a stern and demanding man. He had ruled his family with an iron fist, expecting obedience and conformity. Her mother, a gentle and refined woman, had tried to shield Maggie from his harshness, but she had been powerless to stop the inevitable. Maggie had been expected to marry well, to secure the family's fortune and social standing. She had been courted by numerous suitors, all of them wealthy and influential. But she had found them all lacking, their charms superficial, their affections insincere. Until Samuel. Samuel had been different. He had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. He had courted her with a passion and intensity that had swept her off her feet. He had promised her a life of love and adventure, a life far removed from the stifling confines of the plantation. She had believed him, blinded by her own naive desire for something more. The memory of their wedding day brought a fresh wave of pain. She had worn a beautiful gown of white silk and lace, her hair adorned with flowers. She had walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her heart filled with hope and anticipation. She had exchanged vows with Samuel, promising to love and cherish him until death parted them. It had all been a lie. The discovery of his betrayal had shattered her world. It had ripped away her illusions, leaving her with nothing but pain and disillusionment. She had realized, in that agonizing moment, that she had never really known him, that the man she had loved had been nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. She had fled, leaving everything behind: her family, her friends, her privileged life. She had taken only what she could carry, determined to start anew, to build a life based on her own terms. A life where she would never again be dependent on anyone, especially not a man. The sound of Rhett's hammering brought her back to the present. He was working tirelessly on the wagon wheel, his muscles straining with the effort. He seemed determined to fix it, to keep his promise. She wondered, again, why he was doing this. What was his motivation? Was it simply a sense of duty, a code of honor that compelled him to help a stranger in need? Or was it something more? The wood cracked under his hammer, and he stopped, looking up at her at the sound. The sun was high, and it was already warm. You think about your old life a lot, don't you? He surprised her. Chapter 5. The Unforgiving Heat of Trust. Maggie stiffened, caught off guard by his observation. She hadn't realized she'd been so transparent, that her thoughts had been so readily apparent on her face. She felt a blush creep up her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. "It's hard not to," she said, her voice defensive. "It was my life, after all. Everything I knew." Rhett nodded, his gaze unwavering. He set down the hammer and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. "I reckon it is," he said, his voice softer now. But dwelling on the past ain't gonna help you here. This desert ain't forgiving of weakness. It'll swallow you whole if you let it. His words were blunt, but she knew they were true. She had already learned that lesson the hard way. The desert was a harsh teacher, demanding strength, resilience, and a willingness to adapt. She couldn't afford to be consumed by her past, by her regrets and her bitterness. She had to focus on the present, on survival. "I'm trying," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not easy." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to penetrate her very soul. "No, it ain't," he agreed. "But you're stronger than you think. You made it this far, didn't you?" His words surprised her. It was the first time he had offered her anything resembling encouragement, a hint of belief in her ability to overcome her challenges. It was a small thing, but it meant more to her than she cared to admit. "I had no choice," she said, trying to deflect the compliment. "I had to leave." He shrugged. "We all got choices," he said, "even when it don't feel like it. You chose to run. You chose to survive. That takes guts." She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to understand the man behind the rugged exterior. He was a paradox, a mixture of harshness and unexpected gentleness. He was a gunfighter, a man who had undoubtedly seen his share of violence and death. Yet he was also capable of empathy, of understanding. "What about you?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "What choices did you make?" He turned away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I made a lot of bad ones," he said, his voice low and rough. "Choices that cost me everything." She sensed the pain in his voice, the weight of his unspoken regrets. She knew, instinctively, that he was carrying his own burdens, his own scars from the past. She wanted to ask him about it, to delve deeper into his story, but she hesitated. She didn't want to push him, to force him to reveal secrets he wasn't ready to share. "We all make mistakes," she said, her voice quiet. "It's what we do afterwards that matters." He looked back at her, a flicker of something that might have been gratitude in his eyes. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe that's true." He returned to his work on the wagon wheel, his movements focused and deliberate. Maggie watched him, her thoughts swirling. She was beginning to realize that this journey, this unexpected encounter with Rhett Slade, was about more than just fixing a broken wagon. It was about fixing something broken within herself. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them with relentless intensity. The heat was oppressive, making even the simplest tasks a struggle. Maggie fetched water from the nearby creek, her body aching with fatigue. She offered some to Rhett, and he drank deeply, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup. There was a moment of unspoken connection, a shared understanding of the challenges they faced. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make her heart flutter, to send a shiver of awareness through her. She quickly looked away, her cheeks flushed. She couldn't afford to be distracted, to let her emotions get the better of her. She had to remain focused, to stay strong. As the day wore on, Rhett made slow but steady progress on the wheel. He worked tirelessly, his determination unwavering. Maggie helped where she could, fetching tools, holding pieces of wood in place, offering words of encouragement. They worked together, a strange and unlikely team, bound together by their shared predicament and a growing sense of mutual respect. But the heat and their proximity grew heavy. It built up a layer of sweat, and every shared glance was a spark. "I think," Rhett said, finally taking a step back to appraise his efforts, "that this might just hold." He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat, sweat beading at his temples. "We should try it." The air felt heavy, almost as if it were hard to breathe, though a slight wind had risen, kicking up small, whirling dust devils around them. Chapter 6. Shadows of Doubt and Flickering Hope. The repaired wheel, a patchwork of salvaged wood and Rhett's ingenuity, looked fragile and precarious. Maggie eyed it with a mixture of hope and trepidation. It was their only chance of escaping this desolate stretch of land, but she couldn't help but wonder if it would hold, if it would withstand the rough terrain that lay ahead. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Rhett nodded, his expression confident. It'll hold, he said, his voice firm. I've done this before. She wanted to believe him, to trust his expertise, but the fear of another breakdown, of being stranded again, loomed large in her mind. She had come to rely on him, on his strength and his resourcefulness, more than she cared to admit. The thought of being alone again, without his presence, filled her with a sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. They hitched the horses to the wagon, the animals restless and skittish in the oppressive heat. Maggie climbed onto the driver's seat, her hands gripping the reins tightly. Rhett mounted his black stallion, his eyes meeting hers. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low and reassuring. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "As I'll ever be," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He nodded, and with a gentle nudge of his heels, he urged his horse forward. Maggie followed suit, her wagon creaking and groaning as it began to move. The repaired wheel held, at least for now. They traveled slowly, cautiously, navigating the uneven ground with care. The landscape remained unchanged, a vast expanse of rock and scrub, stretching as far as the eye could see. As they rode, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She scanned the horizon, her senses on high alert, but she saw nothing. It was just a feeling, an unsettling premonition that something was amiss. She had experienced this feeling before, back in Mississippi, in the days leading up to Samuel's betrayal. It was a sense of impending doom, a warning that she couldn't ignore. "Do you ever feel like we're not alone?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Rhett glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "This is a big country," he said. "Lots of things out here." His answer was evasive, non-committal. It didn't reassure her. She knew he was hiding something, that he wasn't telling her the whole truth. She had sensed it from the beginning, that he had his own secrets, his own reasons for being out here. "But do you feel it?" she pressed, her voice insistent. He sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I feel a lot of things," he said, his voice low and rough. "Things I'd rather not feel." She knew he was referring to his past, to the pain and regrets that haunted him. She wanted to ask him about it, to understand the source of his darkness, but she held back. She didn't want to pry, to intrude on his privacy. They rode in silence for a while, the tension between them palpable. The sun beat down on them mercilessly, the heat shimmering off the rocks and sand. Maggie felt a headache building, a throbbing pain behind her eyes. Suddenly, Rhett reined in his horse, his body tense, his gaze fixed on a distant ridge. "What is it?" Maggie asked, her heart leaping into her throat. He didn't answer. He dismounted, his movements swift and silent. He drew his gun, his eyes scanning the ridge. Maggie followed his gaze, her own heart pounding with fear. She saw it, then a flicker of movement, a glint of metal in the sunlight. "Riders," Rhett said, his voice grim. "And they ain't friendly." Maggie's blood ran cold. Bandits. Outlaws. The very thing she had feared. She reached for her own pistol, her hand trembling. It felt small and inadequate in her grasp, a pathetic weapon against the threat they faced. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rhett's eyes met hers, his expression determined. "We fight," he said. "Or we die." He climbed back onto his horse, his gun still drawn. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Stay close to me," he said. "And do exactly what I tell you." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had no choice but to trust him, to rely on his skill and his courage. He was her only hope. The riders on the ridge grew closer, their figures now clearly visible. There were 5 of them, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their guns drawn. They were riding hard, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust. Rhett spurred his horse forward, his body low in the saddle. Maggie followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never faced danger like this before, never been confronted with the threat of violence. She was terrified, but she was also determined to survive. The first shots rang out, the sound echoing across the desolate landscape. Maggie ducked, her body trembling. She heard the whiz of bullets passing close by, the thud of impacts against the wagon. She gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white. This was real. This was happening. The sun was a burning eye in the sky, and the distant mountains seemed to waver and blur. She tasted dust, and her mouth felt dry as cotton.
Get down,
Rhett barked, and she could only obey, blindly, her heart hammering in her chest. Chapter 7. Whispers of Past Betrayals. The gunfire intensified, a cacophony of shots echoing across the barren landscape. Maggie crouched low in the wagon, her body pressed against the rough wooden planks. She could hear Rhett shouting commands, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. He was a natural leader, his experience and confidence evident in every move. She peeked over the edge of the wagon, her heart pounding with fear. She saw Rhett, a whirlwind of motion on his black stallion, firing his gun with deadly accuracy. He was a formidable opponent, his movements swift and precise. He seemed to anticipate the bandits' every move, dodging their bullets, returning fire with relentless determination. One of the bandits fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The others continued their attack, their faces grim and determined. They were outnumbered, but they were desperate, driven by greed and a disregard for human life. Maggie knew she couldn't just cower in the wagon. She had to do something, anything, to help. She reached for her pistol, her hand trembling. It felt awkward and unfamiliar in her grasp. She had never fired it at another human being, never even considered the possibility. She saw one of the bandits riding towards the wagon, his gun aimed at her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked back in her hand, the sound deafening. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred. The bandit was still coming, his face twisted in a snarl. She fired again, and this time, her aim was true. The bullet struck the bandit in the chest, and he slumped forward, falling from his horse. Maggie stared at the fallen man, her stomach churning. She had taken a life. It was a horrifying realization, a burden she would have to carry for the rest of her days. The gunfight continued, the sound of shots and shouts filling the air. Maggie saw Rhett take a bullet in the arm, his face contorted in pain. He didn't falter, didn't slow down. He continued to fight, his determination unwavering. Another bandit fell, then another. Finally, the remaining two bandits, realizing they were outmatched, turned and fled, disappearing over the ridge. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Maggie's ragged breathing and the distant whinny of a horse. Rhett rode back to the wagon, his face pale, his arm bleeding. Maggie scrambled out of the wagon, her legs shaky. She rushed to his side, her heart filled with concern. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his jaw clenched in pain. "It's just a graze," he said, his voice strained.
help me get it bandaged.
She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and carefully cleaned the wound. It was deeper than he had let on, the bullet having torn through muscle and flesh. She bandaged it as best she could, her hands shaking. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You saved my life back there." She shook her head. "You saved mine," she said. "If it wasn't for you," he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite define. It was a look that made her heart flutter, a look that sent a shiver of awareness through her. They sat in silence for a few moments, the aftermath of the violence hanging heavy in the air. The sun beat down on them, the heat relentless. Maggie felt drained, exhausted, both physically and emotionally.
Who were they?
She asked, her voice quiet. "Why did they attack us?" Rhett sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon.
Just bandits, he said.
Looking for easy pickings. She didn't believe him.
She knew there was more to it than that.
She had seen the way they had looked at him, the recognition in their eyes. They had known him. "They knew you, didn't they?" she said, her voice insistent. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I've crossed paths with a lot of men in my life," he said, his voice evasive. "Some of them hold grudges." She knew he was holding something back, that he wasn't telling her the whole truth. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but she held back. She sensed that he was protecting her, shielding her from a darkness she wasn't ready to face. A darkness, whispers in the back of her mind cautioned, that felt eerily familiar. Like the careful lies Samuel had spun. The weight of those memories threatened to suffocate her. The open air offered little comfort. "We should get moving," Rhett said abruptly, breaking the silence. His hand was clenched tightly on the reins. Chapter 8. The Weight of a Gunfighter's Burden. They continued their journey, the landscape slowly changing as they moved further west. The harsh, rocky terrain gave way to rolling hills, dotted with patches of scrub and the occasional twisted juniper tree. The air grew slightly cooler, carrying a hint of moisture on the breeze. Rhett remained silent, his face grim, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He rode with a stiffness that betrayed his pain, his injured arm held close to his body. Maggie watched him, her concern growing. She knew he was trying to be strong, to hide his suffering, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she hesitated. She was still unsure of him, still wary of his secrets. She had trusted a man once, and it had ended in heartbreak and betrayal. She couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. But she couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, the growing sense of respect and admiration she had for his strength and resilience. He had saved her life, protected her from danger. She owed him a debt she could never repay. As the sun began to set, they found a small, sheltered canyon, a natural haven from the harsh elements. They made camp, building a small fire and sharing a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Maggie decided to break the silence. "You never told me your story," she said, her voice quiet. "You said it was just dust, blood, and endless miles."
"But I know there's more to it than that."
He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. The firelight flickered in their depths, revealing a hint of the pain he carried within. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's a long story," he said, his voice low and rough. "And not a pretty one." "I'm not afraid of ugly stories," she said, her voice firm. "I've lived one myself." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether or not to trust her. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He began to speak, his voice slow and deliberate, as if each word was a burden he had to carry. He told her about his past, about a life filled with violence and loss. He had been a lawman, once, a respected sheriff in a small town. He had believed in justice, in upholding the law. But he had been betrayed, framed for a crime he didn't commit. He had lost everything: his reputation, his job, his wife. He had been forced to flee, to become an outlaw, a gunfighter. He had lived on the run, hunted by the very men he had once served with. He had seen too much death, too much suffering. He had done things he wasn't proud of, things that haunted his dreams. He had become a hardened man, a man who trusted no one, a man who lived by the gun. Maggie listened, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his bitterness, his disillusionment. She had felt it herself, the crushing weight of betrayal, the loss of innocence. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes.
"Why?"
he asked. "It ain't your fault."
"No," she said.
"But I understand. I understand what it's like to lose everything, to be betrayed by someone you trusted." He nodded, his gaze softening. "It changes you," he said. "Makes you hard. Makes you doubt everyone. But it doesn't have to," she said, her voice firm. "You can choose to be different. You can choose to trust again." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be looking for something, a glimmer of hope, a reason to believe. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with sincerity. He looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. "It ain't that easy," he said, his voice rough. "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's possible." The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a silence of tension and suspicion, but a silence of shared understanding, of mutual respect. They had both been broken by their pasts, but they were both survivors. They had both found a strength within themselves they didn't know they possessed. He shifted, uncomfortable, and looked back to the fire, prodding a log with the toe of his boot. The sudden movement made him wince, and he held his arm. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice tight with the effort to conceal the pain. The night grew darker, and the stars brighter. The fire was a comfort. Chapter 9. Shelter in a Forgotten Town. The next morning, they set off again, their destination a small, forgotten town nestled in the foothills of a distant mountain range. Rhett knew the town, or at least he had known it once. It was a place where he had hoped to find refuge, a place where he could disappear and start anew. But that had been a long time ago, before his life had been shattered by betrayal. He didn't know what they would find there now. The town might be deserted, abandoned to the elements. Or it might be worse, overrun by outlaws and desperados. He had to be careful, to be prepared for anything. As they approached the town, Maggie felt a sense of unease. The place looked desolate and forsaken, the buildings weathered and dilapidated. There was a silence about it, an unnatural stillness that sent a shiver down her spine. They rode into the town slowly, cautiously, their hands close to their guns. The streets were deserted, the buildings empty and abandoned. It was a ghost town, a relic of a bygone era. "What happened here?" Maggie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rhett shook his head.
"I don't know," he said.
It used to be a thriving town, mining mostly. They continued to explore, their horses' hooves echoing on the dusty streets. They found a few signs of recent habitation: a discarded tin can, a smoldering campfire, a set of fresh tracks in the dirt. Someone had been here recently, but they were nowhere to be seen. They came to the town saloon, a large, two-story building with swinging doors and a faded sign that read the Golden Nugget. Rhett dismounted, his hand on his gun. He pushed open the doors and stepped inside, Maggie following close behind. The saloon was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and decay. The furniture was overturned, the tables and chairs broken and scattered. There were signs of a struggle, bullet holes in the walls, bloodstains on the floor. "This place has seen better days," Rhett said, his voice grim. They searched the saloon, finding nothing but dust and debris. They went upstairs, finding a few empty rooms, the beds unmade, the furniture covered in dust. It was as if the occupants had left in a hurry, abandoning everything they owned. They found a back room, smaller and more secluded than the others. There was a bed in the corner, neatly made, and a small table with a few personal belongings: a hairbrush, a comb, a faded photograph of a young woman. "Someone was living here," Maggie said, her voice soft. Rhett examined the photograph, his brow furrowed. He recognized the woman. It was Sarah, the daughter of the town's blacksmith. He had known her, briefly, before his life had fallen apart. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She used to live here." He felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the life he had lost. He had known Sarah, had even courted her, for a short time. She had been a bright and cheerful young woman, full of life and laughter. He had imagined a future with her, a future that had been stolen from him. He wondered what had happened to her, where she had gone. He hoped she had escaped, that she had found a better life somewhere else. They left the saloon, their mood somber. They found a small, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was in better condition than the other buildings, with a sturdy roof and walls. They decided to stay there, to rest and regroup. They cleaned the house as best they could, sweeping away the dust and debris. They found some supplies in the pantry: canned food, flour, coffee. It was a meager offering, but it was enough to sustain them. They settled into the house, their spirits low. They were safe for now, but they were also trapped. They were surrounded by danger, by the ghosts of the past. They were running out of options, running out of hope. As they ate, the silence between them was more comfortable now. The house was quiet, and the air was still. This would be a place for them to stop and rest, for his arm to heal, for her to regain some strength. But they both knew that they could not stay there forever. Maggie got up and walked to the window. What will we do, Rhett? Her voice was soft, uncertain. Chapter 10. The Price of Survival and Secrets. Rhett didn't answer immediately. He stared into his empty plate, his mind racing. He had no easy answers, no clear path forward. Their situation was precarious, their future uncertain. He had brought Maggie to this forgotten town, hoping to find refuge, but it had turned out to be a dead end, a place haunted by the ghosts of his past. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. She was standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the fading light. She looked fragile and vulnerable, yet there was a strength in her, a resilience that he admired. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough. We'll figure something out. We always do. It was a hollow promise, a desperate attempt to reassure her, to reassure himself. He had no plan, no strategy. He was running on instinct, on a dwindling supply of hope. He knew they couldn't stay in the abandoned house forever. They needed supplies, food, ammunition. They needed to find a way out of this desolate place, a way to reach civilization. He thought about the nearby settlements, the towns and ranches that dotted the landscape. They were all too far to reach on foot, especially with a broken wagon and an injured arm. He needed to find another way, a faster way. He remembered the old mining trails, the narrow, winding paths that crisscrossed the mountains. They were dangerous, treacherous, but they were also the quickest route to the outside world. There are some old mining trails, he said, his voice hesitant. They're risky, but they might be our only chance. Maggie turned to face him, her expression questioning. Risky how? Narrow, steep, landslides, he said. And other things. He didn't elaborate. He didn't want to frighten her. He knew the dangers of the mountains, the outlaws and renegades who hid in the shadows, the unpredictable weather, the treacherous terrain. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze intense. She knew he was holding something back, that he wasn't telling her everything. What other things? She pressed, her voice insistent. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. He knew he couldn't keep it from her forever. He had to be honest, to tell her the truth, even if it meant risking her trust. The men who attacked us, he said, his voice low.
They weren't just bandits. They were looking for me.
Her eyes widened, her expression a mixture of surprise and fear.
Why?
She asked. What have you done? He told her, his voice filled with regret. He told her about his past, about his life as a lawman, about the betrayal that had cost him everything. He told her about the men who were hunting him, the men who wanted him dead. They're called the Blackwood Gang, he said. They're ruthless, dangerous. They won't stop until they find me. Maggie listened, her heart pounding. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the details of his past, made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. So, we're not just running from the desert, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We're running from them. He nodded, his jaw clenched. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't want to involve you in this. I thought we could escape them, that we could start over. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, fear, anger, and something else, something that surprised her. Compassion. She understood his pain, his desperation. She had been running from her own past, from her own demons. It's not your fault, she said, her voice soft. You didn't choose this life. It was forced upon you. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be looking for forgiveness, for understanding. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with sincerity. We'll face them together, she said, her voice firm. We'll find a way out of this. Together. Her words surprised him, touched him. He had expected her to be angry, to blame him for dragging her into his mess. But she had chosen to stand by him, to offer her support, her loyalty. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment of shared understanding. They were two broken souls, drawn together by fate, by a shared need for redemption, for a second chance. A determination settled within him. It hardened his gaze and straightened his back. We leave at first light, he said. We take the trails. It was not a suggestion. He looked to her for assent, and she gave it. Chapter 11. A Dance with Danger and Desire. The first light of dawn found them preparing to leave the relative safety of the abandoned house. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with wisps of cloud. Rhett checked his guns, his movements practiced and efficient. He had cleaned and oiled them the night before, making sure they were in perfect working order. His injured arm was still sore, but he had learned to compensate, to use his other hand with almost equal dexterity. Maggie packed their meager supplies, her heart heavy with apprehension. She had slept little, her mind filled with images of the Blackwood gang, of the dangers that lay ahead. She knew this journey would be perilous, that their chances of survival were slim. But she was determined to face it with courage, to stand by Rhett, to fight for their future. She had come to care for him, more than she cared to admit. His strength, his resilience, his quiet determination had drawn her to him, had awakened feelings within her she thought long dead. They left the house, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the deserted town. They rode slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. They were heading towards the mountains, towards the treacherous mining trails that Rhett had spoken of. As they rode, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced at Rhett, his face grim, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. He felt it too, she knew. The presence of danger, the threat of the unknown. They reached the foothills, the terrain becoming steeper and more rugged. They began to climb, their horses struggling with the uneven ground. The air grew thinner, the temperature dropping. They came to a narrow pass, a winding path carved into the side of the mountain. The drop was sheer, hundreds of feet to the canyon floor below. Maggie felt a surge of fear, her stomach clenching. "Be careful," Rhett said, his voice low. "Stay close to the wall." They navigated the pass slowly, cautiously, their horses' hooves slipping on the loose gravel. Maggie held her breath, her heart pounding. It was a terrifying experience, a test of nerve and endurance. They made it through the pass, emerging onto a wider plateau. They stopped to rest, their horses breathing heavily. Maggie looked back at the narrow path they had just traversed, her legs still shaking. "That was intense," she said, her voice breathless. Rhett nodded, his expression grim.
"It's just the beginning," he said.
"It gets worse." They continued their climb, the terrain becoming even more challenging. They encountered landslides, rock falls, treacherous stretches of loose shale. Rhett led the way, his experience and skill evident in every move. He seemed to know the mountains intimately, to understand their dangers and their secrets. As the day wore on, Maggie began to feel the effects of the altitude and the exertion. She was tired, sore, her head pounding. She tried to hide her fatigue, to keep up with Rhett, but she knew he was aware of her struggles. He stopped frequently, giving her time to rest, to catch her breath. He offered her water, shared his meager rations, his concern evident in his eyes. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when their eyes would meet, and a spark of something would pass between them. A shared understanding, a mutual attraction, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was forming between them. It was a dangerous dance, this attraction. They were both running from their pasts, both carrying heavy burdens. They were in a perilous situation, their lives hanging in the balance. They couldn't afford to be distracted, to let their emotions get the better of them. But the attraction was there, undeniable, a simmering tension that grew with each passing day. It was a dangerous game, a dance with desire and the constant threat of death, played out against the backdrop of the unforgiving mountains. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, they reached a small, sheltered cave. It would offer them some protection from the elements, a place to rest and regroup. They were high up now, and the wind was a biting presence. They built a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. They ate a simple meal, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. They were closer now, not just physically, but emotionally. The shared dangers, the mutual reliance, had forged a bond between them, a connection that was both fragile and powerful. "We will reach Silver Creek by tomorrow, if all goes well," Rhett stated, glancing up at the darkening sky. He was looking at her, his gaze steady, his expression hard to read in the growing darkness. Chapter 12. Unveiling the Scars of the Past. The mention of Silver Creek brought a flicker of recognition to Maggie's eyes. It was a name she had heard before, a town whispered about in hushed tones back in Mississippi. It was a lawless place, a haven for outlaws and desperados, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card. Silver Creek, she said, her voice quiet. I've heard of it. It's not exactly a reputable place, is it? Rhett shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. No, it ain't, he agreed. But it's a place where we can disappear, at least for a while. And it's a place where we can get supplies, maybe even find a buyer for your wagon if we can get it fixed properly. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. It's also a place where I have connections, he added, his voice hesitant. Maggie sensed that he was holding something back, that there was more to the story than he was letting on. She remembered the photograph he had found in the abandoned saloon, the woman named Sarah. She wondered if she was one of his connections, if she was part of the reason he was heading to Silver Creek. Connections? She asked, her voice probing. What kind of connections? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. He seemed to be wrestling with his own demons, deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. There's a man there, he said, his voice low. Name's Silas. He owes me a favor. A big one. He told her the story, his voice filled with bitterness and regret. Silas had been his friend, his partner, back when he was a lawman. They had worked together, fought together, trusted each other with their lives. But Silas had betrayed him, framed him for the crime that had cost him everything. Silas had been working with the Blackwood gang all along, setting him up, using him to further their own nefarious schemes. It had been Silas who had killed his wife, Sarah's elder sister, by many years, framing Rhett for the murder. It had been Silas who had driven him out of town, forcing him to become an outlaw. Maggie listened, her heart aching for him. She understood the pain of betrayal, the crushing weight of loss. She had experienced it herself, at the hands of Samuel. So you're going back there, she said, her voice soft. To confront him? He nodded, his eyes filled with a cold, hard determination. I'm going to make him pay, he said, his voice a low growl. For everything he's done. She saw the darkness in him then, the rage and the thirst for revenge that consumed him. It was a dangerous side of him, a side she hadn't seen before. It frightened her, but it also intrigued her. She reached out, her hand touching his arm. He flinched at her touch, his muscles tense. She didn't withdraw her hand, but kept it there, offering a silent gesture of comfort and support. Be careful, Rhett, she said, her voice earnest. Revenge is a dangerous game. It can consume you, destroy you. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be looking for something, a glimmer of hope, a reason to believe in something other than vengeance. He covered her hand with his own, his touch surprisingly gentle. His hand was calloused and rough, but there was a warmth in it, a tenderness that belied his hardened exterior. I know, he said, his voice rough, but I can't let him get away with it. I have to do this. For myself. For her. He was referring to his wife, Maggie knew. He was driven by a need to avenge her death, to find justice for the woman he had loved. They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The night was cold, but there was a warmth between them, a shared connection that transcended the darkness and the danger. He leaned forward slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but she felt it. His breath was on her cheek, warm. And there was a fragility in the air, a potential and a question. Chapter 13. The Sheriff's Gaze and Hidden Agendas. The moment shattered as a rock, dislodged from somewhere above, clattered down into the small cave opening. Rhett pulled back instantly, his hand reaching for his gun. He scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, his senses on high alert. Stay here, he whispered, his voice tense. He moved silently to the mouth of the cave, his body low, his gun drawn. He peered out into the night, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. Maggie watched him, her heart pounding. She felt a surge of fear, a premonition of trouble. She knew the mountains were full of dangers, both human and animal. After a few moments, Rhett returned, his expression grim.
I didn't see anything, he said.
But I don't like it. We should move on. They packed their belongings quickly, their movements hurried and efficient. They extinguished the fire, leaving the cave in darkness. They mounted their horses and rode out into the night, the moon their only guide. They rode for hours, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult. They were heading towards Silver Creek, towards a confrontation with Silas, towards an uncertain future. As dawn approached, they reached the outskirts of the town. It was a sprawling settlement, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. It was a bustling place, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. It was a haven for outlaws and desperados, a place where anything could be bought or sold. They rode into the town slowly, cautiously, their hands close to their guns. The streets were crowded with people, a mix of miners, cowboys, gamblers, and prostitutes. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and gunpowder. Rhett led them to a livery stable, a large, ramshackle building on the edge of town. He dismounted and spoke to the stable owner, a grizzled old man with a missing eye. He arranged for their horses to be cared for and for the wagon to be repaired. They found a small, relatively clean hotel, a 2-story building with a faded sign that read the Silver Dollar. They checked in, taking a room on the 2nd floor, overlooking the street. The room was sparsely furnished, with a bed, a chair, and a washstand. It was basic, but it was clean and relatively safe. They washed and changed, trying to remove the dust and grime of their journey. Rhett's arm was throbbing, the wound inflamed and swollen. Maggie insisted on cleaning and rebandaging it, her touch gentle and caring. He winced in pain, but he didn't complain. "We need to find Silas," he said, his voice grim. "But we need to be careful. He's dangerous, and he has friends here." They decided to start their search at the largest saloon in town, the Gilded Cage. It was a notorious establishment, known for its rough clientele and its crooked games. They entered the saloon cautiously, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. The place was crowded and noisy, filled with the sounds of laughter, shouting, and the clinking of glasses. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. They made their way to the bar, ordering drinks from a surly bartender with a scarred face. Rhett scanned the room, his eyes searching for Silas. He spotted him across the room, sitting at a table with a group of men. Silas was a large, imposing figure, with a cruel face and cold, hard eyes. He was surrounded by his henchmen, a group of rough-looking characters with guns strapped to their hips. Rhett felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for revenge. He wanted to confront Silas, to make him pay for his crimes. But he knew he had to be patient, to wait for the right opportunity. Suddenly, a man stepped in front of them, blocking their view. He was tall and well-built, with a stern face and a badge pinned to his chest. He was the sheriff, the law in this lawless town. "You're new here," the sheriff said, his voice gruff. His gaze was sharp, assessing, and it lingered on Rhett. "What's your business?" There was a pause, and the noise of the saloon seemed to fall away. Chapter 14. Promises forged in the crucible of fear. Rhett met the sheriff's gaze, his expression calm and unreadable. He knew he had to be careful, to choose his words wisely. This sheriff, whoever he was, represented a potential threat, a complication he didn't need. "We're just passing through," Rhett said, his voice even. "Looking for supplies. And maybe a buyer for a wagon." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. He seemed to be weighing Rhett's words, assessing his truthfulness. He then glanced at Maggie, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "You're a long way from home," the sheriff said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What brings you to Silver Creek?" Maggie spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. "We're looking for a fresh start," she said. "A new life. We've had some trouble in the past." The sheriff's gaze shifted back to Rhett, his eyes probing. What kind of trouble? Rhett hesitated, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to reveal anything about his past, anything that could be used against him. But he knew he couldn't lie. Not completely. The sheriff was too sharp, too perceptive. Personal trouble, Rhett said, his voice evasive. Family matters. The sheriff didn't press him, but he didn't seem entirely convinced. He continued to study them, his gaze unwavering. Silver Creek ain't a place for the faint of heart, the sheriff said, his voice a warning. It's a rough town, full of rough people. You best watch yourselves. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Rhett and Maggie watched him go, their hearts pounding. They knew they had aroused his suspicion, that he would be watching them. We need to be careful, Maggie said, her voice low. He doesn't trust us. Rhett nodded, his expression grim.
I know, he said.
But we can't leave. Not yet. I have to find Silas. They spent the rest of the day exploring the town, gathering information, trying to locate Silas's whereabouts. They learned that he was a powerful figure in Silver Creek, a man who controlled much of the town's illicit activities. He was feared and respected, a man who ruled through intimidation and violence. They also learned that Silas was rarely seen in public without his henchmen, a group of loyal and ruthless men who protected him at all costs. Confronting him would be dangerous, perhaps even suicidal. As evening approached, they returned to their hotel room, their mood somber. They were no closer to finding Silas, and they were running out of time. The sheriff was watching them, and the Blackwood gang could be closing in. They sat on the bed, facing each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. Maggie reached out, her hand touching Rhett's arm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, determination, regret, and something else, something that made her heart flutter. I'm scared, Rhett, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if we can do this. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. We can, he said, his voice firm. We have to. We'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His eyes searched hers, his gaze intense. He seemed to be on the verge of saying something, of doing something, but he hesitated. I promise you, Maggie, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I won't let anything happen to you. I'll protect you no matter what. It was a promise forged in the crucible of fear, a vow made in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a promise that bound them together, a commitment that transcended their individual struggles. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She trusted him, she realized. She trusted him with her life, with her heart. It was a terrifying realization, but it was also liberating. She was no longer alone. She had someone to lean on, someone to fight alongside. He leaned in a little more. We need a plan. His voice was quiet, determined, and it chased some of the uncertainty away. He was focused again. Chapter 15. The bitterness of old wounds reopened. Rhett's words, though resolute, did little to quell the knot of anxiety twisting in Maggie's stomach. A plan. It sounded so simple, so logical. But formulating a plan against a man like Silas, in a town like Silver Creek, felt like trying to build a dam with sand. What kind of plan? She asked, her voice betraying her doubt. Rhett paced the small confines of their hotel room, his brow furrowed in concentration. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his own inner turmoil. Silas is always surrounded by his men, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. We need to find a way to isolate him, to get him alone. That's the only way I can confront him. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and regret. There's a place, he said, his voice hesitant. A place outside of town. An old mine. Silas used to use it for private meetings. He paused, his jaw tightening. Maggie sensed that this place held painful memories for him, that it was connected to his past, to his betrayal. It's risky, he continued, but it might be our only chance. If we can lure him there, we might be able to deal with him. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. The word deal hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. This wasn't just about confrontation, it was about revenge. It was about settling a score, about righting a wrong. She understood his need for vengeance, his burning desire to make Silas pay for his crimes. But she also feared the consequences, the potential for violence, for bloodshed. "And how do we lure him there?" she asked, her voice cautious. Rhett's expression hardened, his eyes filled with a cold, hard light. "We use bait," he said. "Something he wants. Something he can't resist." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "We use me." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The idea of Rhett putting himself in harm's way, of using himself as bait, filled her with dread. She couldn't bear the thought of him getting hurt, of losing him. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It's too dangerous. There has to be another way." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "There isn't," he said. "This is the only way. I know Silas. I know how he thinks. He won't be able to resist the chance to finish what he started." He was referring to his past, to the betrayal that had cost him everything. He was willing to risk his life, to walk into a trap, to get his revenge. Maggie argued with him, pleaded with him to reconsider, but he was unyielding. His mind was made up. He was determined to confront Silas, no matter the cost. Finally, she realized she couldn't stop him. She could only support him, help him in any way she could. She had come to care for him too deeply, to respect his strength and his courage, to deny him her loyalty. "All right," she said, her voice resigned. "But I'm going with you. I won't let you face him alone." He looked at her, his eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. He hadn't expected her to agree, to put herself in danger for his sake. "Maggie," he began, his voice hesitant. "No arguments, Rhett," she said, her voice firm. "We're in this together. Remember?" He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I remember," he said. They spent the rest of the evening formulating their plan, working out the details, preparing for the confrontation that lay ahead. It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. As the plan solidified, taking on a grim reality, a silence fell, filled with unspoken feelings, doubts. The air seemed to crackle. Then, as if a dam had burst, Maggie spoke, her voice laced with bitterness. "It's always like this, isn't it? Men and their promises. Their betrayals." Chapter 16. A ride through the heart of deception. Maggie's words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Rhett flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. He knew she wasn't just talking about Silas, about their current predicament. She was talking about Samuel, about her own past, about the betrayal that had driven her from her home. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and understanding. He knew he couldn't deny the truth of her words, the pain that fueled them. Men, himself included, were capable of great cruelty, of breaking promises and shattering lives. "Not all men," he said, his voice low and defensive. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were inadequate, a feeble attempt to deflect her pain. She scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, really?" she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "And you're different? You, a gunfighter, a man who lives by violence?" He didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the floor. He couldn't defend himself, not against the truth of her accusations. He had lived a life of violence, a life of taking and hurting. He had made mistakes, choices he regretted. "I'm not Samuel," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not him." It was a plea, a desperate attempt to differentiate himself from the man who had hurt her so deeply. He wanted her to see him, to understand him, to trust him. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She seemed to be weighing his words, assessing his sincerity. He held her gaze, his own eyes filled with a plea for understanding. "I know you're not him," she said finally, her voice softer now. "But it's hard to trust, to believe." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. He understood. He knew the damage that betrayal could inflict, the scars it could leave on a soul. He had his own scars, his own wounds that refused to heal. "I won't lie to you, Maggie," he said, his voice earnest. "I can't promise you a perfect future. I can't promise you safety or happiness. This life, it's all I know. But I can promise that I will never do anything to intentionally cause pain. It was a simple promise, a humble offering, but it was all he had. He couldn't change his past, but he could choose to be different, to be better. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotion, sadness, hope, and something else, something that made his heart ache. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And that's enough.
For now.
They fell silent, the weight of their unspoken feelings heavy in the air. They had reached a fragile understanding, a tentative truce. They had acknowledged their pasts, their pain, their doubts. They spent the rest of the evening preparing for their ride to the abandoned mine. Rhett crafted a message for Silas, a carefully worded note designed to lure him into their trap. He would send it through one of the saloon workers, a young man he had befriended earlier in the day. The plan was set. Rhett would ride to the mine alone, posing as if he were seeking a meeting with Silas. Maggie would follow at a distance, staying hidden, ready to intervene if necessary. It was a dangerous plan, fraught with risk. But it was their only hope of confronting Silas, of settling the score, of finding some semblance of peace. As dawn approached, they prepared to leave. Rhett checked his guns, his movements practiced and efficient. Maggie packed a small bag with supplies, her heart pounding with apprehension. They rode out of town under the cover of a gray and heavy sky. The journey was a tense, silent ride through the heart of deception, and with every step, they both felt the cold presence of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Chapter 17. The Cost of Loyalty and Second Chances. The ride to the abandoned mine was tense and silent. The landscape was bleak and unforgiving, mirroring the turmoil in Maggie's heart. The sky remained overcast, a heavy, gray blanket that seemed to press down on them. Rhett rode ahead, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He was a man on a mission, driven by a need for revenge, for justice. Maggie followed at a distance, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the premonition that something was about to go wrong. She had trusted her instincts before, and they had rarely failed her. She knew this plan was dangerous, that it was a gamble with their lives. As they approached the mine, Maggie saw at a gaping hole in the side of the mountain, a dark and ominous entrance to a forgotten world. The area around the mine was deserted, littered with rusted equipment and decaying timbers. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a place where lives had been lost and fortunes squandered. Rhett dismounted, his hand on his gun. He looked back at Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. "Stay here," he whispered.
Stay hidden. And be ready.
She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched him disappear into the darkness of the mine, her heart aching with fear. She had a terrible feeling, a sense of impending doom that she couldn't shake. She dismounted and tethered her horse to a nearby tree, her hands trembling. She found a hiding place among the rocks, a vantage point where she could see the mine entrance, but remain concealed. She waited, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The air was heavy with anticipation, with the threat of violence. She saw him, then Silas. He emerged from the mine, followed by his henchmen. He was a large, imposing figure, his face cruel and ruthless. He was exactly as Rhett had described him, a man without conscience, a man who reveled in power and control. Rhett was standing in the clearing, his back to the mine entrance. He was unarmed, his hands held out to his sides, a gesture of surrender. It was a calculated move, a part of their plan, but it made Maggie's blood run cold. Silas approached Rhett, his eyes filled with a cold, hard light. He stopped a few feet away, his henchmen flanking him, their guns drawn. Well, Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Look what the cat dragged in. I thought you were dead, Rhett." Rhett didn't answer, his gaze fixed on Silas's face. He was waiting for the right moment, the opportunity to strike. "You shouldn't have come back," Silas said, his voice laced with menace. "You should have stayed away. Now, you're going to pay for your mistakes." He signaled to his henchmen, and they raised their guns, aiming at Rhett. Maggie's heart leaped into her throat. She had to do something, to intervene, to save him. She stepped out of her hiding place, her pistol drawn. "Drop your weapons," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. Silas turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected her, hadn't anticipated her presence. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice filled with anger. "It doesn't matter," Maggie said, her gaze unwavering. "Drop your weapons or I'll shoot." The henchmen hesitated, their eyes flickering between Silas and Maggie. They were unsure of what to do, caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events. Silas laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "You?" he said, his voice mocking. "You're going to shoot me? You don't have the guts." He signaled to his henchmen again, and they raised their guns, aiming at Maggie. She knew she was outgunned, outnumbered. She was facing a desperate situation, a moment of truth. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and one of Silas's henchmen fell to the ground, clutching his chest.
It was Rhett.
He had used the distraction, the moment of confusion, to draw a hidden weapon, a small derringer he had concealed in his boot. The other henchman turned, firing at Rhett. He returned fire, his movements swift and precise. A gunfight erupted, the sound echoing across the desolate landscape. Maggie fired her pistol, aiming at the remaining henchmen. She hit one, then another. They fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground. Silas, enraged and desperate, charged at Rhett, his hands reaching for his throat. They grappled, struggling for control. Silas was stronger, overpowering Rhett, forcing him to the ground. Maggie saw it happening, saw Silas's hands tightening around Rhett's neck. She ran towards them, her heart pounding with fear. She raised her pistol, aiming at Silas's back. She hesitated, her finger on the trigger. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take another life, not even to save Rhett. Suddenly, Rhett twisted, using his body weight to throw Silas off balance. He rolled away, drawing his knife. He lunged at Silas, his blade flashing in the sunlight. The fight was over in an instant. Silas slumped to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. Rhett stood over him, his chest heaving, his knife dripping with blood. He had done it. He had killed Silas. He had avenged his wife, his past. But there was no triumph in his eyes, no sense of victory. Only sadness, regret, and the heavy weight of another life taken. The cost. It weighed on them, heavy and present. Maggie went to him. Chapter 18. Reckoning under a blood-red moon. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Rhett's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a raven. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, a grim reminder of the violence that had just transpired. Maggie stood frozen, her pistol still clutched in her trembling hand. She had witnessed the brutal confrontation, the desperate struggle for survival. She had seen the darkness in Rhett, the rage and the thirst for revenge that had driven him. But she had also seen his courage, his determination, his unwavering loyalty. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, exhaustion, regret, and a profound sadness. He slowly lowered his knife, the blade stained with Silas's blood. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. Maggie nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She holstered her pistol, her hands still shaking. She walked towards him, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She reached out, her hand touching his arm. He flinched at her touch, his muscles tense. She didn't withdraw her hand, but kept it there, offering a silent gesture of comfort and support. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on Silas's lifeless body. I don't know," he said. "I did what I had to do." She understood. She knew he had been driven by a need for justice, for retribution. But she also knew that taking a life, even the life of a man like Silas, would leave a mark, a scar on his soul. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. The sky turned a deep, blood red, a fitting backdrop to the scene of violence and death. They needed to leave this place, to escape the ghosts of the past, to find a new beginning. But they also needed to deal with the aftermath of the confrontation, with the bodies of Silas and his henchmen. "We can't just leave them here," Maggie said, her voice quiet. Rhett nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "We'll bury them. It's the least we can do." They worked together, their movements slow and deliberate. They dug shallow graves in the rocky soil, burying the bodies of the men who had died. It was a grim task, a somber reminder of the fragility of life. As they worked, Maggie couldn't help but think about the choices they had made, the paths they had taken. They had both been driven by their pasts, by their pain and their regrets. They had both sought solace in revenge, in violence. But she realized that revenge hadn't brought them peace. It hadn't erased their pain, hadn't healed their wounds. It had only added another layer of darkness, another burden to carry. When they were finished, they stood by the graves, their hands clasped together. The blood-red moon had risen, casting an eerie glow over the landscape.
"What now?"
Maggie asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotion, sadness, hope, and something else, something that made her heart ache. "We leave," he said, his voice firm. "We leave this place, and we never look back." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "We start over," he said. "Together. If you'll have me." It was a question, a plea, a tentative offer of a new beginning. He was asking her to stay with him, to share his life, to build a future together. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his eyes, the scars of his past. But she also saw his strength, his resilience, his unwavering loyalty. She saw a man who had been broken, but who was trying to heal, to find redemption. She found that she did not need to think. The answer was there, plain and honest. "Yes," she said. Chapter 19. The Fragile Bonds of a New Beginning. Maggie's yes hung in the air, a fragile promise amidst the desolation and the lingering echoes of violence. Rhett looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking confirmation, reassurance. He had offered her a future, a life together, and she had accepted, despite the uncertainties, despite the darkness that still clung to him. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was tender, filled with a reverence that surprised her. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "For believing in me. For staying." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, gratitude, and a burgeoning hope that she had almost forgotten how to feel. "We'll make it work, Rhett," she said, her voice firm. "We'll build a new life. Together." They left the mine, leaving behind the graves, the ghosts of the past, the weight of their shared burdens. They rode away from the setting sun, towards an uncertain future, but they rode together, their hands clasped tightly, their hearts intertwined. They returned to Silver Creek, their arrival unnoticed amidst the usual chaos and clamor of the town. They retrieved their horses from the livery stable, the repaired wagon looking surprisingly sturdy and reliable. They spent one last night in the hotel, the room feeling different now, no longer a refuge from danger, but a temporary haven on their journey towards a new beginning. They didn't speak much, their silence filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared experiences. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But there was a closeness between them, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of fear and violence. They had faced death together, had survived, and had emerged stronger, more resilient. As they lay in bed, the darkness surrounding them, Rhett reached out, his hand finding hers. He intertwined his fingers with hers, his touch a silent reassurance, a promise of connection. "We need to leave this place," he said, his voice low. "Go somewhere far away. Somewhere where no one knows us. Somewhere where we can start over. Maggie nodded, her head resting on his shoulder. Where?
She asked.
He thought for a moment, his mind searching for a destination, a place of refuge, a place of hope. California, he said finally. I've heard stories of fertile land, of sunshine, of opportunity. It was a dream, a distant vision of a better life, a life free from the shadows of their pasts. It was a gamble, a leap of faith, but it was something to cling to, something to strive for. They left Silver Creek at dawn, their wagon loaded with supplies, their horses rested and ready for the long journey ahead. They rode west, towards the setting sun, towards the promise of a new beginning. The landscape slowly changed as they traveled, the harsh, rocky terrain giving way to rolling hills, then to vast plains, stretching as far as the eye could see. The air grew warmer, the sky a brilliant blue, unburdened by the heavy clouds that had followed them for so long. They faced hardships and challenges, but the land was not fighting them. They were working with it, working together. The bond between them held. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The journey to California was long and arduous, testing their resilience, their strength, their newfound bond. They faced scorching heat, dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of danger, both from the elements and from the remnants of their past. But they faced it together, their shared experiences forging an unbreakable connection, a love that blossomed amidst the hardships. They learned to rely on each other, to trust each other implicitly. Maggie discovered a strength within herself she never knew she possessed, a resourcefulness born of necessity. Rhett, in turn, began to shed the darkness that had clung to him for so long, finding solace in Maggie's presence, in her unwavering belief in him. They talked, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. Maggie spoke of her desire for a simple life, a life free from the constraints of her past, a life filled with peace and contentment. Rhett, in turn, revealed his yearning for redemption, for a chance to atone for his past mistakes, to build a life worthy of Maggie's love. As they neared California, the landscape transformed, becoming lush and green, a stark contrast to the arid deserts they had traversed. They saw rolling hills covered in wildflowers, vast fields of golden wheat, and towering redwood forests that reached towards the sky. It was a land of promise, a land of opportunity, a land that seemed to welcome them with open arms. They found a small, secluded valley, nestled between rolling hills and a sparkling river. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a place of peace and tranquility. It was here that they decided to make their home, to build their new life. They purchased a small plot of land, enough to build a modest house and to cultivate a small farm. They worked together, side by side, their hands calloused and sore, their bodies aching with fatigue. But they worked with a sense of purpose, a sense of hope, a sense of building something lasting, something meaningful. They built a small, cozy house with a porch overlooking the valley. They planted a garden, filled with vegetables and flowers. They acquired a few livestock, a couple of cows, some chickens, a faithful dog that quickly became a beloved member of their small family. Their life was simple, but it was fulfilling. They found joy in the small things, in the beauty of nature, in the warmth of their home, in the companionship they shared. They had found peace, contentment, a love that had blossomed amidst the hardships and challenges of their journey. But the past, like a persistent shadow, still lingered. Rhett continued to be haunted by his memories, by the violence he had witnessed and participated in. He struggled with guilt, with regret, with the fear that he could never truly escape his past. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Maggie noticed the familiar darkness in Rhett's eyes. She reached out, her hand gently touching his. "What is it, Rhett?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I don't deserve this," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve this happiness." Maggie tightened her grip on his hand, her gaze unwavering. "Don't say that," she said, her voice firm. You do deserve it. We both do. We've been through so much. We've earned this. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. The past is the past, Rhett. It doesn't define us. We can choose to be different. We can choose to be happy. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be looking for something, a glimmer of hope, a reason to believe. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with love and understanding. He leaned forward and he closed the distance. The kiss was a culmination, a final seal. It spoke of forgiveness, trust, and a future, finally, that was theirs. The horizon held all their tomorrows. Epilogue. Years passed, and the valley blossomed under their care. The small farm flourished, providing them with sustenance and a modest income. Their house, once a simple structure, grew with their family. 2 children, a boy and a girl, filled their lives with laughter, with joy, with the boundless energy of youth. Rhett and Maggie grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. The scars of their pasts remained, etched on their hearts and minds, but they no longer defined them. They had found peace, contentment, a love that had endured the trials and tribulations of their journey. Rhett never completely escaped the shadows of his past. There were nights when he would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the memories of violence and loss. But Maggie was always there, her presence a comforting anchor, her love a soothing balm. She would hold him, whisper words of comfort, and remind him of the new life they had built together, the family they had created, the love that had blossomed amidst the ashes of their pasts. Their children grew, learning the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. They heard stories of their parents' journey, of the hardships they had overcome, of the love that had sustained them. They learned to respect the land, to appreciate the simple things in life, to cherish the bonds of family. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, casting a golden glow over their home, Rhett and Maggie sat on the porch, their grandchildren playing at their feet. They were old now, their bodies frail, their hair silvered with age. But their eyes still sparkled with love, with the joy of a life well lived. Rhett reached out, his hand gently touching Maggie's. His fingers, once calloused and rough, were now gnarled and weathered, but his touch was still tender, filled with a love that had endured the test of time. "We made it, Maggie," he said, his voice a soft whisper. "We found our paradise." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yes, we did, Rhett," she said. "Together." They sat in silence, their hands clasped together, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple. The valley was bathed in a golden light, a scene of peace and tranquility. They had found their home, their sanctuary, their place of refuge. They had faced the final confrontation of hearts and horizons, and they had emerged victorious. Their love had triumphed, their bond unbreakable. They had built a life together, a legacy of love, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The circle was complete. The air was warm, the sky a vibrant canvas. And, hand in hand, they watched content.